Hey there ladies, and this is my Queenager newsletter, and as you can see I'm in the glamorous surroundings of Gatwick Airport, which is a bit of a first for this newsletter. We're off to walk the Camino, but this is the Queenager newsletter for this week. So when you read this, I will be, well, I thought I would be in Portugal, but actually I'm in the airport on our way to start our noon Camino walk to Santiago de Compostela. We've got 18 Queenagers and we're all planning to walk 120 kilometres in 6 days. So wish us luck. I've just bought Compeed blister plasters from Boots, and we've got some really sturdy hiking boots. And also on my way back from Cornwall, where I was last weekend while charging the electric car, I did some great retail therapy at Mountain Equipment and bought some of those walking trousers which unzip into shorts, which is another first in my life. I'll fill you in on all our adventures next weekend. And you can of course watch them, and this is the video version of the newsletter. If you want the actual written one, go to noon.org.uk. So let's go back to what we were thinking about. Kind of this week, and it's been a bit of a kind of, you know, good noon kind of. It's been a good noon week. We've had a couple of things go viral. There are links in here. And if you fancy a bit of a noon adventure like the one we're doing on the Camino, there are still a few spots left on our Wazing retreat on April the 24th. And I'm going to be in Oxford speaking to our new Oxford Circle members on April the 23rd, which is free to everybody. So do check out the website if you're in the Oxford area and you'd like to come. It's in the evening. And we've got our London Noon Circle on May the 11th. We've got a fantastic new venue near Oxford Circus. So do check that out. And if you're not around, then you can also join the online circle in May. So it's been a really pretty busy week. I went on Women's Hour on Wednesday to talk about Queenagers and the workplace, gendered ageism, and how it's so bonkers that so many of us are getting whacked or finding it difficult to get new jobs because we don't get our pensions until we're 67. I mean, so we've got to keep working. Lots of us need to earn a living. And also, as Dr. Lucy Ryan's research shows, 70% of us want to power up our careers. We don't want to sit with our feet up, we want to be working. But there's such a huge perceptual gap between how we Queenagers feel about ourselves and our ambition and our sense of wanting to move into a new chapter and start a new circle at 50 and our becoming, and how we're still perceived out there in the world. And it's really interesting that my Women's Hour piece has gone completely viral on Instagram when I talk about what will be familiar to a lot of you about 50 being only halfway through, that it's only lunchtime in the 100-year life. So it was very good to go on Women's Hour to bang the noon Queenager drum, and it's really pleasing that that positive message about what women are for and what we have to offer has gone down so well. So do have a look at the clip if you didn't see it. I'd also love to hear how you're finding it out there in the whole workscape at the moment. Have you been whacked? Have you been having problems finding a new job? Do you want to work but you're having problems, or you're trying to pivot? Do email and tell us, eleanor@noon.org.uk. So, in other news this week, I went back to school. I suppose having just been on Radio 4 was a pretty good way to turn up at my old school reunion. Thursday evening was the day of the Westminster School 80s Gaudy, as it was termed. Gaudy means celebrate, so it was a kind of a reunion of everybody being at school in the 80s. The party was held up school, which at Westminster means the hall where we all took our exam. And the school I went to was in Little Dean's Yard, right under Westminster Abbey, right by the House of Commons. And I have to say I haven't been back to my old alma mater much since I left in 1989, except once in my hack heyday to talk to all the kids about journalism, which was also a bit of a strange one. I suppose I haven't been back because being there as a girl in the sixth form, about 70 girls, 800 boys, wasn't an entirely positive experience. Walking back into the main quad of Westminster School this week brought all of that back. A sense of being on a stage, of being watched by hidden eyes from all the windows, and overall of just feeling constantly and endlessly judged. And no, that wasn't my paranoia, it really was a fact of life. The school website now prominently features girls, but sexism at the school when I was there was really extreme. When we used to walk into the dining room, all the boys would call out a sexiness score out of 10. And if that wasn't bad enough, I once got yelled at by a famously terrifying member of staff in that very same dining room. He called out in a booming voice so that everybody could hear, "Lassie, you look like a prostitute in that skirt." Not great when you're 16 and trying to find your feet. He did eventually apologise, but only after my mother had complained to my housemaster, the governors, and to the then headmaster. So they didn't really particularly take it very seriously. It was interesting being at the party and talking to a lot of the other women who'd been there, and discovered that we all felt pretty weird about being back. There must have been about 150 of us at the party, and working the room, chatting to lots of the old Westminster girls, they really shared my sense of actually a bit of trauma of being back there, and particularly walking across the quad, what we call yard in Westminster vernacular, and how we'd felt so exposed and vulnerable when we were there. We all agreed that we'd made great friends at the school. I reckon that's probably some trauma bonding, and that we'd been incredibly well taught. I wrote a lot of my Oxford English finals on material I'd been taught at Westminster during my time there. But that also being exposed to that kind of bear pit at 16, really being in the kind of belly of the patriarchy, had been terrifying, but also stood us in quite good stead in terms of navigating careers in male-dominated professions afterwards. I certainly don't think I would have handled 25 years in newspapers if I hadn't learned to stand my ground with a group of chaps in my teens. I learned kind of how to handle it. But it wasn't easy. We were outnumbered. Many of us old Westminster girls still bear the scars. And what has changed through that, though, I suppose, is that the school now recognises that maybe it wasn't the best idea to just import a few females in the sixth form. In fact, one of the teachers who addressed us this week while we were at the school, because they were flashing up loads of photos from the 80s, and all of them, the girls are massively outnumbered by the boys. And he actually apologised for having put us in that situation as women. He said that Westminster now's realised the error of its ways, and just recently announced that from next year it will go entirely co-ed from age 5 upwards, so there'll be equal amounts of girls. I actually found that surprisingly moving, because it so reflects what I expect is a very queenager experience of having been given the kind of lanyard into a male-dominated world, but not really entering a place that was actually set up for us as women. I think many of us queenagers who are in midlife now started out in a world which had reluctantly let us in, had given the pass into the building, but was only allowing us entry into a system which had been created by and set up for men. And there had been very, very little thought about what it would actually feel like to be a girl within that system. At Westminster, we girls were definitely an oddity. We were such a minority. It was a bit like being a celebrity because there were so few of us, and the boys were a sea of raging humans. Hormones. But we also felt like outliers, weird aliens allowed in on sufferance, maybe to boost the A-level results and civilise the boys in the sixth form, without much thought of what it was going to be like for actually us being there. It was an experience, strangely, which was repeated when I got to Oxford. In my college there were no portraits of any women on the walls. It was as women had only been in there for about 10 years. It had been a men's college for centuries. And we were definitely made to feel like we were interlopers. Nothing was set up for us. No portraits of famous women on the walls. We were a kind of weird new anomaly. And I'm afraid, this really has left some marks. I was chatting about what this meant with some of the other women at the Geordie, and we all had stories of being sexually preyed upon by teachers and tutors. That was certainly my experience at Westminster and at Oxford. One of my Westminster teachers declared undying love for me and proceeded to pursue me even after I'd gone up to Oxford. I once found him sitting outside my college room, and he tried to kiss me several times while I was still at the school. And then when I got to Oxford, another tutor, who I'm actually very fond of, wrote me love poems, quite sweet and courtly poems, but nonetheless not what we would expect of a teacher nowadays. So I suppose it did make me feel like things have changed in some ways for the better. And this wasn't just my experience. I wasn't particularly special. All the women I spoke to at the Geordie at Westminster had similar tales. One woman who'd been there a bit ahead of me said, "I was very well taught. It was just a bit weird that the teachers kept wanting to cop off with us." Yeah, fair enough. And in fact, one of the teachers who was at the party on Thursday had been married 3 times. All of his wives were former students. So it really was pervasive then. And I suppose what a look back showed me is that, to take some positives out of all of this, is actually how much things really have changed. I'm glad that now a teacher who tried to kiss a sixth form student would be struck off, and that it would be seen as a serious safeguarding issue. It certainly wasn't then. And I think that goatish dons now would also think twice about making a move on a student or writing them love poems, because it would jeopardise their tenure. I think what was really confusing, if I look back, was what we were told, because we were let in there at all. We were told that women had equality, and what more did we want? The institutional line was, we've let you in, haven't we? But that was, of course, nonsense. We were in the foothills of equality. We've been allowed in, but it will take centuries for these kinds of institutions to really see women as equal and to change themselves and the way that they're set up, so that the experience becomes sufficiently integrated so that women feel like they really belong, not that they're like added extras after thousands of years. And essentially it made me see that we queenagers have lived through enormous social changes, particularly when it comes to sexual matters. And I'm not saying there aren't predatory teachers or male bosses out there now. You know, of course we know that there are. But at least in 2026 they could lose their job for it. Whereas back in the day it was just like we women were meant to kind of expect it. And I must say I'm very glad that that's changed for my own daughters and for the women who come behind us. I had to say, I remember back then most of the boys and men who talked to me speaking to my chest at Westminster, lots of the boys would come up to me and go, hello lefty, hello righty, oh hello Eleanor, talking about my breasts. And I suppose when we were growing up we were just supposed to put up with that kind of sexual, that kind of thing. The sexual free-for-all was just the water in which we all swam. And there was and is such a double standard around women. Of course, as teenagers, we wanted to be attractive. We were told our value depended on it. You know, that score when we got shouted at in the hall. But it was so hard to get it right. Too short a skirt and you were a tart. I was told that by the head of discipline himself said so. And too long a skirt and you were dismissed as frigid and a frump. As ever for women, the line to walk was thin and changeable. And I remember the boys dividing girls into who was pretty and who was sexy. And being told I was sexy but not pretty. Eek. I mean, just navigating all of that was really, really difficult. It was a really difficult, it was a difficult time. And I think also when I got to into the world of work, it wasn't really that much better. During my time in newspapers, when I was dispatched in my 20s to go and interview kind of world leaders, everyone from the Dalai Lama to Charlton Heston, I'm sure that part of the reason that I was deployed like that was because these older men often used to be amazed when I asked a sharp question. I would often just felt like I was being dismissed as a kind of busty blonde, kind of young woman. But I suppose luckily when I wrote up the copy, I'd get the last laugh. So it was a pretty strange trip down memory lane, thinking about what it used to be like to be a woman, and probably not one that I'll be repeating. But on a more positive note, and this is really important to say, I was really touched by how many of my old school contemporaries knew about Noon or were following these newsletters. And that wasn't just the women, that includes the boys too. There was one lovely man I talked to who said, oh, I read lots of your stuff. And I was a bit cynical. I was like, oh yeah, I doubt it's really up your street, is it? And he said really sweetly, he said, my wife loves your newsletter and your book, and I've read it too. It was really sweet. And another woman came up to me, said she'd wept all the way through Much More to Come because she recognised so much of it in herself and she'd just been whacked. I talked about being whacked on Woman's Hour as well. And also I was really touched by how many of my male contemporaries from Westminster sidled up to say how much they'd enjoyed reading my columns and features over the years, which was really not something that I'd expected. So it wasn't all bad. So to sum up, I'm sure I would never have had the career I had without having gone to Westminster, and I thank it for giving me some of my oldest and dearest friends. In fact, in the newsletter today, you'll see a picture of me with my old friend Ahara, who's one of my very best friends in the world. But I did leave thinking about the power of these old school networks, how they endure, the entrenching of privilege. And I was also struck by how many of the old pupils and the people I met at Westminster had sent their own kids to the school. I promised never to do that, and at £52,000 a year I couldn't have afforded it if I'd wanted to. But the networks that underpin the British class system are still formed in the quads of our public schools, and I do know how privileged I was to be there. But I suppose at least in the future girls will be an equal part of that at Westminster from the get-go. The question is that really progress, or are we just kind of entrenching a kind of, multi-sexual privilege? Anyway, much to ponder. I'd love to know if you've been back to a school reunion and what it brought up for you. Do email me, eleanor@noon.org.uk. And I'd really like to know what you think about that kind of sexual double standard that we were so much a part of when we were there, and how difficult that was. So have a fantastic week. I better go and get my flight, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for spending this time with us. Bye.